pop up on your computer in a second, just noting that by remaining in the meeting, you're consenting to it being recorded. This is primarily going to be one way. This is a little bit more like a webinar because we have a lot of content to get through, but this will be saved and available for viewing if you ever need a refresher or if any teammates that maybe weren't a part of this presentation would like to view it. So I am going to be using the chat pretty actively today as well. To get things started, just to make sure we're all looking at the same things, I'm actually going to share a copy. It's not the final copy of the document, but the most recent version of the strategic plan. So I'm not sure if this has been shared with you yet, but I went ahead and put it in the chat, and we will go through this document a little bit today. I noted that this is not the final version. We presented at the county board commission meeting on Tuesday, and there were a couple changes on one of the goals that one of the commissioners had requested. So there will be some slight verbiage changes in the final document, but 98% of it will remain the same from this point forward. So another note, I'm not 100% sure how fast we'll fly through this content. We may have time for a little Q&A at the end. If we do not, I will share this slide deck with you. This is my email. Please do not be shy if you have questions or you'd like to follow up on anything specifically as how it relates to your department. I'm not charging your department individually. And as far as I'm concerned, follow-up is an important part, which is included for my client services. So I'm more than happy to chat with you one-on-one by email, phone, Zoom, if you have any questions about how implementation of the strat plan will look in your department. I'm here to support your success. And honestly, if you contact me too often and annoy me, I will let you know. But I've never had anyone reach that threshold yet, so please feel free to reach out. So our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to be looking at, now that we have a strategic plan, how do we use it? How do we implement it effectively? And how do we use the strategic thinking muscles that we've developed through this process to identify, discuss, and solve future issues, as well as what are effective ways for us as an organization to report out to the public and commissioners on how we are implementing our strategic goals. Some departments already have annual reports or plans that they publish as it is, but this is more of how do you, as a part of the larger county ecosystem, share your benchmarks for this strategic plan, and what does that look like in a public-facing context? So before we get too far ahead, and you'll remember if you were in workshops with me, we use this little Poll Everywhere website. So I'm going to drop in the chat a link to this. Otherwise, you can feel free to follow that QR code. So if you could just respond quickly to me on this question. This is anonymous, so don't be embarrassed to answer, but I'm actually very curious how many of you have had a chance to actually look at the document so far, because I know there was going back and forth. It came out officially last Friday, I believe it was sent over, so we haven't had it for very long. I just want to know for my use, how familiar you are with the document at this point, and there's not a wrong answer. I will spend more time introducing you to the document if more answers are that you haven't really gotten familiar with it yet. So I'll give you a few minutes to go ahead and answer, and this is going to track responses as they come in. Again, it's anonymous, so please don't be scared to click nope if that is the truth. I want to make sure that we maximize this time together. Okay, oops, I think I might have actually locked you guys out of it. Hang on one second. Sorry about that. Did everyone get a chance to answer? If you need another second, I can make sure it's still active.
Yeah, I was able to answer.
Okay. Okay. So overwhelmingly, we're hearing no, and that's okay. I'm glad I know that so I can facilitate this presentation effectively. So with that in mind, let's actually introduce you to this document. And I've dropped that link to my Google Drive where you can access this current version of the document The final document, once we make those revisions requested by the commission, will be released to you, as well as a packet of materials for implementation, kind of some manuals and documents we'll introduce to you in this session. So you'll actually receive the final version of this shortly. But if this is your first time seeing it, is receiving this link in your chat, let's go through it really quickly of what to expect when you review this document. So the document is broken up into three main sections. I will note too that we have two versions of the document. You will primarily, as employees, be working with the internal version of the document. The internal version of the document has a little bit more depth to it. There are kind of internal working framework documents. It also has a little bit less fluff. We have a public facing version of the document. The public facing version of the document is about the same length, but it lacks some of the framework pages. We'll get into what those are. And it's something that we envision kind of living in a public space on your website, whereas the internal version is what employees use. All of the goals, objectives, and initiatives are the same. It's just sort of a different look and feel of what's included in the final document. So the first really pages 0 through 6 is just kind of your introductory fluff, lists everybody's names, a little bit of background, demographic information on the county. The real meat and potatoes starts on page 6. So the first 3 pages, 6 through 8, they outline the goals, the mission and vision that we arrived on through the strategic planning process, as well as some important summary and definitions of some of the terms that we use throughout the document, such as data measures, goals, objectives, and initiatives, which we will see throughout this plan. It introduces us at a high level, kind of as an executive summary, to the 9 strategic goals within the plan. And you'll see that we have them broken into 3 categories. The first goal, which is really the goal for year 1, we've numbered goal 0. In order to make sure that, sorry, I hit something on my end. In order to make sure that you are in a position to be successful in implementing this document, we don't want you to hit the ground running, immediately diving into those 8 goals. We'd like to see the organization ideally spend year 1 identifying how you will measure data, right? It's one thing to set a goal, but it's another to actually have benchmarks to prove that you're accomplishing it, or to measure when there's a deficiency where either there's a lack of tools or resources to successfully implement that goal. So we're really suggesting in year 1, which would be 2025, Kalamazoo County has a strong focus on being implementation ready. The latter years, so 2026 through 2029 and beyond, that's where you'll dive into those subsequent 8 goals, external and internal. Now, external, internal is a little bit of deceptive language because there is some policymaker role across both, and staff will obviously be involved across both. But when we use external, internal, it sort of relates to how we discussed issues in our workshops earlier this summer, where we talked about whether it's something about a user experience, a customer of Kalamazoo County, or whether it relates to your internal functions. The real inside of the plan that's quite lengthy is the plan narrative. This has pages 9 through 22, a breakdown of all 9 goals. It defines the goal, explains why it's important, and then it outlines the objectives, initiatives, and data measures. So this is really kind of the big bulk of the document. However, we've gotten some feedback from past clients that this format of the document is not the easiest to work off of. So knowing that, we have provided a framework in the appendix. This is the document that's really sort of the working document. It's only available in the internal facing document, and it's something that's very easy to manipulate in Excel. We'll send it to you in an Excel version as well, so you can continue to update it. And it has form editable areas where you could reset how much of a priority something is. We realize that prioritization changes within an organization, as well as understanding what the resource needs are for each of those specific initiatives and what the data measures are. We also note as well the SWOT analysis. I know that diving into the SWOT analysis is something that can be a little bit challenging for organizations. We described it as ripping a Band-Aid off. We do our best to not let the weaknesses and threats really be an emphasis in the public-facing document. We really want any addressing of weaknesses and threats to be seen as solutions oriented. We're defining what we want our future to be, not dwelling on our current problems. So you don't actually see those SWOT analysis connections in the public facing document. You only see those in the framework. And that's intended to be a reminder of where we came from and why we arrived on this as a strategic priority. So I will assume that you will take time after this session to dive deeper into the final document. And of course, please remember if you have any specific questions to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to go through any that you might have about the document. But now that you've actually seen the document, let's talk about what your goals are for success with this document. We don't want to see the plan get what? Stuck on a shelf and get dusty. And the best way that we can ensure that that doesn't happen is by shifting your organizational mindset. Too often, we get really great feedback from organizations and local governments saying, oh, we loved this exercise. This is something we just don't do that often. We don't come together cross departmentally. We don't come together and have more informal interactions with our commissioners. The only time we ever see them is informal commission meetings, or we tend to kind of interact with the same key departments, but we never see maybe folks lower down on the org chart interact with other departments. So we get a lot of feedback from people saying, we really enjoy doing these kind of out of the box problem solving activities. That's great. The best thing I can suggest to you is that you don't wait another 5 years to do them. And that really relies on shifting your organizational mindset to say, planning is not just something that we put out by RFP every 5 years. It's a muscle that we use regularly. And planning is a process that we revisit frequently at the department level and organizationally. So before we dive too quickly into how to do that, I want to walk you through an analogy called rocks, pebbles, and sand. And this is the main reason that I hear organizations tell me why they don't feel like they have time to work on their strategic plan. And I understand it. I know that I worked in local government for a decade before I started this business. I understand how easy it is to get caught up in distractions day to day. So the rocks, pebble, sand analogy, it is a bit woo-woo, but it's used often by executive coaches, life coaches, and it's really a way of looking at time management, productivity, and prioritization. There is a short 4-minute YouTube video that does a wonderful job of demonstrating and visualizing this. I'm not going to show it on the meeting because we don't have enough time for that. And you all can use YouTube on your own. Maybe you've even heard of this before, but I did drop that YouTube link in the chat if you'd like to take a look at it in the future. So when we think about our life and we think about our workplace and what our day-to-day looks like, rocks are the big picture priorities we have for ourselves, for our role, for our department. Pebbles are your day-to-day job. And then sand, I mean, if you've ever gone to the beach, sand are the little things that get everywhere and they're almost impossible to get rid of, right? They follow you. They're in your towels, they're in your seats, they're on your car floors. Even if you don't want them there, you can't escape them. Now, we know all too well that we may have the best intentions to have our days be structured around big picture priorities, but sometimes they get thrown off course, right? Maybe it's an elected official who has a concern that suddenly is on the top of your desk, top of your to-do list. Maybe you have a personnel issue that all of a sudden dominates your time. Who knows what it looks like? Oftentimes when I talk to folks in local government, they say their favorite thing about local government is the unpredictability. But then I also hear in the same breath them say things like, I get most of my work done after business hours or on weekends because it's the only time I can get it done without distractions. So it's finding that healthy balance of how you can make your priorities first and foremost. So I will be walking you through at a very high level a management style called Entrepreneurial Operating System, EOS. And I have been quietly planting the seeds of this methodology over the last few months and working with you, and you'll see them peppered throughout the plan. But they use the word rocks to describe what your big picture priorities are across the organization. So what would our day and our work look like if we had the ability to focus on our rocks first, right? If we think about this jar in this visual analogy as our time for every day, and this is what that little video I linked to shares. If we think about the jar as the 24 hours we have in the day, the 8 or 7.5, depending on how your workday is structured, hours you have in your workday, how do you maximize that time, right? The tasks are all there, but how do you make them all fit? And the real breadth of this analogy is that if you start with sand, and you can kind of see this visualized on the screen right now, if you let the little things dominate your schedule first, they will pack down, they will fill up your schedule, they will fill up your time. If you then put the pebbles in on top, there's almost no room left in the jar. So your time, your 8 hours a day, is taken up entirely by these interruptions, emergencies, reprioritizations. They're par for the course. But then when you do your regular day-to-day job on top of that, there's no time left for those big picture priorities that are a part of the strategic plan. So we have to kind of rethink how we approach our day. How do we still recognize that sand is undeniable? We're going to have those issues, we're going to have those concerns, interruptions, etc. But make sure that we set ourselves up for success, that the rocks are going in the jar first. We make space intentionally for our strategic priorities first. Then we let our day to day job fill in around that. And then the sand comes in last. It's the same amount of time, same amount of tasks, but we're getting dramatically different results in terms of what we accomplish by having our priorities go in the jar first. Now, at this point, I usually get a few eye rolls that are like, okay, yeah, right. You come do my job and then tell me that I have time for everything. I get it. But let's take the work context away from it and talk about something that we probably all mean to do more that we're really bad at. And I am owning this myself. I could work out a lot more than I actually do. So I looked up what are the top ways to actually make yourself work out? What are the best ways to make sure it becomes a part of your schedule? There was an article in Forbes in 2020, and they had these top 4 tips. Make yourself the first priority of the day, pencil it on your calendar, keep your tools on hand close by so that you can't talk yourself out of it, and have an accountability buddy. Now, yeah, we're all nodding. We're like, yeah, those do sound like great ideas. It's really not a very different list when we look at how to make your rocks a priority in strategic plan implementation. We're going to coach you on how to structure check-in meetings to check on your data measures of how strategic implementation is going. We encourage you as an organization to set these meetings regularly and to keep your goals and issues lists on hand. Again, we'll coach you on how to develop those, as well as staying accountable to your team members. And an important part of that accountability is accountability doesn't really work, in my opinion, if it's associated with shame. If someone's going to be embarrassed to acknowledge that they're not where they hope to be on a goal, they're either going to lie or become disenfranchised from the process. So this accountability needs to come without judgment. If you want to support one another and see your organizational be successful in implementation, it needs to be without judgment, which means acknowledging sometimes you're on track for a goal and sometimes you're not. And rather than questioning why you're not, let's just focus on how to support one another to get there more quickly. So we talk a lot about revisiting the plan. We don't want this plan to get dusty, right? We don't want it to be a document that just gets filed away on a shelf and never looked at again. But we get it. It's overwhelming. There are over 70 objectives and initiatives within this plan. While we only have 9 goals, there's a lot of meat underneath it. We have very intentionally broken up and structured when your target completion or implementation date is in that plan. You may recall about a month or so ago, we sent out a survey where we asked you to assign prioritization of how highly you prioritized a certain objective, initiative, or goal, and when you thought it needed to be completed. We didn't ask you by what date. We said, how important is this to you? Is it urgent? Is it, yeah, it's important, but it's not urgent? Or is it, that's kind of a nice to have pie in the sky. We'll get to it if we have time. We took and analyzed your responses and structured them across the calendar. Now, we also know if we don't give you a healthy amount to accomplish right out the gate, you're going to end up in year 5 with 80% of the plan not implemented. So there is kind of a science to that framework document that has those target completion dates, but we know that they're going to be fluid. The other thing to consider too in implementing a strategic plan or really tackling anything in your life that's large and overwhelming is that with any large task, there's only one way to eat that elephant, and it's one bite at a time. So the takeaway here is that everything in life that's overwhelming, including a 77 initiative strategic plan, is less impossible when we break it down into bite size, right? So when we talk about one bite at a time, we recommend that your organization revisit your strategic plan on either a weekly or biweekly basis. This can either be as a part of an existing team or department head meeting you already have, or in a new meeting. Now, I know most people are like, please, God, no more meetings. But if you have a way to wrap in these strategic goal check-ins into your existing meeting structure, great. But you should be meeting at a bare minimum twice a month for a 1-hour meeting that is focused specifically on strategic plan check-in and identifying new and emerging issues. So oftentimes, some of these issues that we hear emerge in a SWOT analysis or in a strategic plan, they started as sand, right? Once long ago, the big pressing issue that's now made its way into your SWOT analysis was just a pesky grain of sand that maybe a peer or a manager or an elected official brought forward to you. By giving yourself specific space on a weekly or biweekly basis where part of that time is set around identifying and using these strategic thinking muscles on how to address issues. It not only gives you two things, it gives you the space to schedule the sand. So the sand comes in, there's nothing we can do about it, but you can say, this isn't my sand time. My sand time is every Tuesday at 9 a.m. when I have my strategic meeting with my team, right? That's when we work through issues. By having that time, you can actually pencil it in. You can say, sand, not today, you're a Tuesday problem. You also have a little bit more language to use with commissioners. And I don't know exactly what the dynamic looks like in your organization, but I have some clients where they say, no, you don't get it. If an elected official calls me and says, I need to work on this, it's not negotiable. That means drop what you're doing and work on it. A lot of what I do in coaching organizations is helping them to figure out ways that are consensus driven to set healthy boundaries. It's really not appropriate for an elected official to dictate what your day-to-day looks like if they're a policymaker in their role. It's a little different if you're an elected official in a department head role. But if you're a policymaker, you should not be telling staff what to do day to day and managing their schedule. That's what you're in charge of and your supervisors are in charge of. So by establishing those healthy boundaries and by having these meetings, when that issue comes forward, you can say, thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. We'll address that in our next Tuesday meeting, right? So it's setting a boundary and setting an expectation of when you'll get back to them. They know, okay, I'm going to hear from them in at least a week, and it gives them space to understand when it's appropriate to follow up with you. Now, we're going to include some guides, including this one that we have screenshotted on the screen here about how often you should meet and what the context of those meetings look like. So you have a short 1-hour meeting that we recommend that weekly or biweekly, and we even give you an agenda for what that looks like based on the EOS principles. But then you should have longer goal setting meetings where you're really diving into what you're working on, what you're facing, what challenges you're facing on a quarterly and yearly basis. Many of these can be facilitated on your own. Your leadership has the skills to do these meetings, and we really feel that bringing your team members back together in these collaborative work sessions, it actually does a lot of good, not only to build trust and partnership across departments, but to also connect folks back to mission and vision and feel like they actually see the bigger picture of what their job includes. As far as doing a full rewrite of a strategic plan, that's really the only time we'd even advise it to bring in an outside facilitator. That's what we did, obviously, for this process. Much of this, we want to set you up for success so that you can do it on your own without paying someone to do it. You already have leaders that have these competencies in-house. So we'll cover quickly what those look like. Like I just said, you'll see your full strategic plan revision every 3 to 5 years. 5 is more normal, especially for larger organizations. Sometimes we see smaller organizations that have a lot of agility. They're very nimble. They have a lot more leeway. They're less bogged down by the committee structure of a larger government entity. If you guys manage to knock out most of this plan in 3 years, I will fall down dead and be very impressed. So I challenge you to do that, but let's set our sights realistically on 5 years. Your goal across a full review is to revisit your mission, vision, and values, do a full SWOT analysis, and define your strategic goals. And this process takes several months. Obviously, we've been working together since April, so this is kind of a long haul, much longer than the other revisits you'll have. Once a year, we recommend that you have a 1-hour, 3-year goal setting meeting of department heads. And you could use a facilitator externally, but you could also just do this with leadership. This is where you're setting kind of those visionary goals, those fuzzy, not so specific goals of where you'd like to see your department or organization 3 years into the future. Once a year, we also think you should do a 1-year goal setting exercise, which can be done in tandem or separately with the 3-year goal exercise. This, again, can be facilitated internally, possibly a little bit longer depending on how you approach this workshop, but you would identify your big picture goals and have them be less fuzzy. This time we're thinking more mission-oriented goals than vision. They should be SMART goals and something that you can document and work off of and benchmarks against. On a quarterly basis, this one's one that we get the most resistance from clients on. We do recommend, if there's the possibility of pulling this off on your schedule, bringing department heads together quarterly. And this quarterly half-day workshop is an opportunity to boil down your big picture goals, those 1- and 3-year goals, into 90-day increments. The EOS model is really geared around 90 days. There's actually quite a bit of science that shows that anytime we set a goal that's further out than 90 days, our brain doesn't even really fully comprehend that time. It seems like 90 days is this perfect length of time that our brain understands and we can rationalize working backward from. If it's any further away than that, 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, our brain doesn't really process it the same way. So, really taking advantage of the fact that our brains already are wired to work well on a quarterly goal setting schedule, use your 90-day meetings as a chance to really identify what your department is going to do towards that bigger picture goal. Now, we talked about these weekly or biweekly meetings. This is that opportunity with your internal facilitator. This would likely, in an organization as large as yours, be accomplished in both the internal and external administration divisions versus being across the entire organization just from a number of people standpoint. But you'd meet for 1 hour. This could be tacked on or included in an existing meeting or become a standalone meeting. And your goal would be to check in with emerging issues, have a quick accountability check with your colleagues on how you're doing on your goals. If you need support, help, or to workshop a problem with others, again, without judgment, and to use those strategic thinking muscles that we've honed now to actually check in on those emerging sand issues. If you have issues coming in, things that are new, you want to talk it through, you'll have a group of folks who you're not taking advantage of their time. They're literally gathered and convened for this exact purpose. All right. So
Wait, that's John Cross's team? That's not.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi, I'm so sorry I got wrapped up in a thing. Hi.
You're all good. You're all good. All right. So I keep mentioning these EOS practices. So these are books that I'm a huge fan of. I'm a big reader and I'm also like weirdly addicted to corporate self-improvement. So I've read so many of these books. And as far as ones that I actually believe in and think, yeah, wow, this could work, this is one of the best. So I was first introduced to these books several years ago when I worked in local government. And one of our contractors that we worked with, you could just tell working with them that they had a very honed process in their business. I'd never worked with any company before where it was so clean, it was so consistent. And their team, I mean, it was almost cult-like. It was almost like they, were being hazed and all had to memorize the script, right? But they didn't deliver it in an inauthentic fashion. It really came across. So I just said to the owner, I said, what is your secret sauce? What are you doing that your business is so consistent, that your processes feel the same every time we work with you? Every time we see you run a workshop, it's run like clockwork. Your team is all on the same page. I'm like, what's going on? Like, are you secretly a cult leader or what's the Kool-Aid here? So she shared, no, it's just this book. We operate on this training module. You can get certified in it, or she's like, you can just read the books and apply it yourself. There's all these DIY tools. So I bought the book. I read Traction first. Traction is one that's more geared towards managers. What the heck is EOS is written at a much more basic level that's more geared towards team members. These are phenomenal. So I've actually already bought copies of these books for your leadership team. They've had them since March. So there are copies of these on site in Kalamazoo if you ever want to dive deeper into them. I'm also going to drop in the chat as well a link to the EOS website if you'd like to poke around a little bit there. I am not certified in EOS. I've thought about it, and if I ever do, I will offer that retroactively to my clients that have done strategic planning to walk them through this and see how to apply it. But I don't necessarily believe that you need to work with a skilled facilitator on this. It's pretty easy to follow. So I'm going to walk you through at a high level what that framework looks like and how we've set you up for success with this model with your strategic plan. So the EOS framework is based on what looks like this little trivial pursuit pie piece. And there's 6 components that you have to make sure are all working together for your business to be successful. And I'll walk you through each of them and how we've applied it to your strategic plan already. So the first is having a clear vision. You'll recall that we went through that vision building exercise where we all had to write on Post-its what we thought we wanted to see for the organization and the community 5 years into the future. It's making sure that everyone understands what that vision is, they're familiar with the verbiage of it, and furthermore, they see a meaningful connection between the work that they do day to day and that bigger picture vision. So this was the vision statement that emerged out of our workshops together. And you'll see this in the final plan and likely throughout the organization moving forward. So vision's an important piece. Now we'll talk about data. So we have given you suggestions for every single initiative within this plan, a data measure. But as we mentioned, rather than jumping immediately into implementation, we want to ensure that you have the infrastructure in place to be effective at implementation, which means knowing what you're tracking, having the tools to track it, and then having clear expectations on how frequently you deliver those measures. We don't want to necessarily assign you data just to track data. We want to make sure that they're tools and measures that actually make sense when you apply them in your job, as well as having the infrastructure that it's not onerous or super time consuming to go ahead and track that data. So we will have deputy administration likely work with you at a departmental level to understand what measures should be tracked so that we have some common benchmarks across the organization. There's one organization in particular that we are kind of obsessed with, the quality of benchmarking that they do. Now, their website is actually undergoing updates right now, but I'm going to give you this link. And again, you'll have this on hand when you get this slide deck after this is recorded. I highly encourage you to check out the City of Durham. They're one of the best local government entities I've ever seen in terms of benchmarking. So not only have they made their strategic goals extremely digestible for the public, folks who don't work in government to understand, they also have benchmarks that are updated, I believe, monthly by departments where you can actually track performance. It's phenomenal. I've not seen many other organizations that have that depth of ability. And I've already talked with your administration team to see if that might be something that you could do in the future. Now, we talked about your framework, the real working part of the document, which is in the appendix of the internal plan. It has suggested under each initiative, you'll see in that third column, the data measures. These are suggestions. You may have a different data measure that emerges more naturally to you. We just basically say you should have a data measure, whether or not it's the one we suggest, that's up to you. But we base these based on what we think would be the easiest to track and which would be the most likely to not be onerous for you to track as well. Now, another thing to talk about too, when you do these progress updates, we talked a little bit about accountability and about judgment, right? When you have these weekly or biweekly meetings, we want to be sure that your check-ins, you follow a regular schedule. We're not here to shame someone. If someone says, nope, I'm not on target with this goal, the point is not to embarrass them. It's just to understand where you are and do so without emotion. Oftentimes, when emotion gets involved in decision making, that's when the worst parts of our personalities come out. By making yourself an organization that's very data driven in its decision making, we can remove some of those emotional strains. Process is another thing. Like I told you when I worked with this company in Ohio that just totally impressed me. It was so evident to me that their processes were seamless, they had been well thought through, and they were able to be replicated regularly. There, you'll see quite a bit on one of the goals under the importance of organizational processes. But as you look not only towards succession planning as leadership will change in recent years within the organization, you also want to make sure that you're constantly looking at your processes for opportunities for efficiency. Are you doing things consistently? Are you delivering the best customer service experience consistently? Are you making the best and highest use of your employee skills? If I had to guess, I would say that generative AI, if not already playing a minor role in your organization, will be playing a much larger role in yours and other government organizations over the next 5 years. And it will help you realize this highest and best use of your employees' skills and time. And lastly, we talked at length in the document about the need for documenting processes and the importance that plays in succession planning when you see leaders transitioning in the organization. Issues, or sand, as we like to call them. By creating that dedicated space in these biweekly meetings for issue discussion, you are giving yourself a chance to set boundaries around how much you let those emerging issues, those shiny objects, those phone calls, and those quote unquote emergencies, how much you're allowing them to fill up your time jar, and how much you're allowing them to dictate what your day-to-day looks like. It's important that these issues, not all of them are emergencies. Frankly, honestly, I've learned in working with organizations, if you say, okay, let's pretend today's Tuesday. All right, we have a meeting next Tuesday. We'll get to that. I'd say 75% of issues work themselves out without you being involved. Because guess what? When you don't respond on demand, people innovate. If someone's really upset about something and you don't have the time to get to them for 7 days, they might figure it out before you get back to it. That's ideal. But if it is an issue that merits thoughtful discussion, you are not doing that issue justice by dropping what you're doing and giving half-assed attention to it. By having dedicated time where you bring together a collaborative and thoughtful team to discuss issues, you're actually giving them the attention that they deserve. and through collaboration, by having chance to sort of noodle on it with your peers, you're actually likely to come up with more effective responses and thoughts around that. So setting these new norms around issue discussion is so important for your success. And then lastly, people is a huge part of the equation of those 6 pie pieces. Not only is it important to have the right people, you also need to have them in the right seat. When we say right people, we mean, are you hiring for values? And is your organizational structure correct? Are people working at their highest and best value in the seats they're in? So you might recall that we did this exercise where we made a word cloud back in our April visit, where we asked you to describe when Kalamazoo County employees are at their best, what do they demonstrate? What are their character traits? And this was just kind of what we captured from that word cloud of some of the most common traits that you had. We analyzed them, came up with the top 5. And these were the top 5 that describe how Kalamazoo County government, which is obviously made up of a lot of people, when we distill you down to how you approach your workday and how you deliver your best work every day, these were the 5 values that rose to the top. So really ensuring through your recruitment and interview process that you're interviewing for not only skills, but for values. You know, skills can be trained and can be taught. Values are inherent in a person, and making a more intentional effort to measure people's values when you're interviewing them ensures that better cultural fit within your organization. And then lastly, accountability. Do you actually have the ability to say, this is what I'm going to accomplish in the next 90 days, and a support structure between departments to, without judgment, cheer one another on? This is a really important part to make sure that the rubber hits the road, that you don't just become an organization that has lofty goals, but become an organization that's actually achieving lofty things. So I want to take a little bit more time to talk, going too fast, about identify, discussing, and solving. We understand wholeheartedly and want to make space for the fact that those sand issues will emerge. You will have new issues that we haven't thought of come up. You will have maybe new elected officials that have a bee in their bonnet and they have one issue they really want you to work on. You may have constituents or customers who just decide, this is my prerogative, I'm going to beat you down until you deal with it. We get it. This is the fact. When we write a 5-year plan, as soon as we send on the email and send you the document, something new is going to come up and it'll be rendered obsolete, right? We know that. So we want to give you a tool that can be flexible, but we also want to teach you these skills on how to be adaptive for the new issues you will encounter over the next 5 years. This is why we encourage these regular check-ins and why we give you these tools to continue to use the muscles we've started using with you through the time that we're not there. So we will provide to you as a part of that packet of support items how to gather and discuss organizational issues. And something that all of you should within your organization be documenting in a visible location is a list of issues. Now, here's the thing. You have to first create a psychologically safe space where people feel that they can share their issues. But you also have to realize that it's okay to be vulnerable and share issues. If you're facing maybe an issue in your department, no one in the history of, undiagnosed deaths, as far as I know, has ever had their cause of death being vulnerable about issues that they're having in their job, right? We have to normalize this idea that we can and we should be open about issues with our peers. And it does not reflect failure. It reflects a willingness and a desire to want to grow and change. Writing down issues as you encounter them is honestly evidence that you have a healthy, honest, and open culture. And when you have a healthy, open, and honest culture, you have a healthier and honest team. And those teams statistically have an easier time sharing those issues over time. So if you're hiring the right people, surrounding yourself with the right people, and meeting regularly and creating this judgment-free space, you will be a more effective and collaborative team 5 years from now. Another part of talking through issues is realizing, and remember how we said a couple minutes ago, if you're just fitting an issue in, you're probably not giving it due diligence. You're not really giving it the discussion it deserves. We often don't realize that the root cause is not what we're diagnosing right out the gate. Too often issues are actually symptoms and they are not a few layers down. So part of this identify, discuss, solve that we suggest that you set half of your strategic plan check-in meetings time aside for is actually have this conversation where you say, is this a symptom or is this the root cause? And 90% of the time, it's not the root cause. And oftentimes the cause of the real issues are people. Oftentimes, whether it's a customer or person in the organization, maybe you hired the wrong person for a task, or maybe it's a person that has the right values, but they're not in the right seat within the organization. So having a space to have uncomfortable conversations at time, but creating that psychologically safe space in which to have them, it will lead you to more honest conversations as you look at issues within your organization. Now, the other thing too is it's so important to remember the order IDS, identify, discuss, solve. It's so tempting to do that approach backwards, right? We want to jump right into solutions. But something that we gained that I hope has stuck with you through the strategic plan development process is the value of identifying and discussing, right? And we walked through these exercises where we would adopt the persona of an individual in the community. We would talk about what is the risk we take by doing nothing. We would identify that future state of where we want to be. You need to create space for people to get their ideas out on the table. Now, that said, when we talk about these strategic thinking sessions, when you have an issue you're going to be discussing, we suggest, and this is right out of EOS, you allow everyone one chance to speak. There's always going to be people in the room that are going to beat the drum. And if you let folks dominate the conversation in an inequitable fashion, it will hinder that psychological safety of that space. So give people a chance to get their thoughts out on the table and say it once, but only once. Once you've had that discussion, then you can jump into solving. Now, we also don't only want to be in crisis mode where we're reacting to existing issues. You can take preventive action. The earlier and more intentionally you create space to go through your SWOT analysis, which we suggest that you identify and refresh that SWOT once a year, but also through these biweekly meetings where you address those sand issues, you're really setting yourself up for success because you're taking more preventive action. So in summary, we don't want you to have meetings just to have meetings. We want your meetings to be productive and solutions oriented as well as psychologically safe. If you follow our suggestions on what that agenda looks like and the frequency of those meetings, you'll find that these meetings include an element of accountability and setting clear steps in establishing who will be doing what and by when they will complete it. By using the IDS process to work through those emerging issues, you will dig deep and sometimes get uncomfortable. But even if it does get uncomfortable, you can rest assured that it's an important part of being a more collaborative and trust-filled team and working towards that big picture vision you have for this plan. So I want to talk quickly again in a little bit greater depth about vision. When we analyzed what you came up with on those Post-its in that exercise across the 2 workshops in April about what your community vision was, they were really robust. We had truly hundreds of Post-its to analyze, but there were some commonalities and themes that emerged that we want to share with you here. So when we look at what your focus was externally, we really saw an element of stewardship. Your desire was to be inclusive and collaborative within your communities that you serve, as well as focusing outwardly on them. This means focusing on having help for all residents of the county and really kind of negating the idea that the county doesn't serve everyone. The county does serve everyone, and that's a message you want to work hard to reinforce. Empowering communities, ensuring happy neighborhoods, prosperous communities, and then realizing that you will continue to grow. How can you do so in a way that it is sustainable and safe? When we look internally, you really set some high standards for yourself, and this is super admirable. We see that you hope to be a model of excellence in local government. And that really shows up in 4 separate ways. Firstly, you're setting a pretty audacious goal for yourself to be an employer of choice, where you are attracting the best talent. You manage to strike that healthy balance of work and life. You're fully staffed and not facing these recurring staffing shortages that have been plaguing the organization, and truly identified as the best place to work if you want to work in local government. You also have a desire to be innovative and forward thinking. You want to see more technology integration, more efficiencies, this willingness to try new things and have a little bit more of an entrepreneurial mindset, streamline your processes, and constantly be looking to improve. If you follow these processes and how you review and check in on your strategic plan, you will find yourself developing these muscles over time. We also loved the fact that you put out the bold claim of not only do we want to be an employer of choice, we want to be a role model among other government agencies. We want other government organizations to look to us for best practices, be fiscally responsible and highly transparent in our practices. And lastly, have a greater element of civility. While not across the organization, we did pick up on some tension and challenges interdepartmentally. So, how can your organization move away from some of the negative leadership traits that have been evident in the past, but not since this recent administration changed, to be more welcoming, kind, fair, engaged, and respectful of one another? Now, we talked about reporting out. This is an important part for accountability to the public and for your commissioners. Now, we do highly suggest that once that website's back up and running for Durham, you poke around a little bit and check out their strategic plan dashboard. We would love to see if that's something that Kalamazoo County could implement over the next 5 years to have that greater layer of transparency and reporting to the public of what you're working on and how successful you are in doing it. So we've designed a fillable implementation tool that we will share for your organization. And this gives you a chance to diagnose at your own departmental level what your 90-day, 1-year, 3-year, and 5-year goals are for the department, how your department ties into the big picture of the county. And this is a document that can be edited in either Word or in Adobe. So it's something that you can keep on hand and update. And we suggest that you keep it on hand so that you can really revisit it. We also really want to make sure that you use the strategic plan benchmarking and data tracking as a way to educate elected officials. So often when we talk about relationships with commissioners or city councils, village boards, et cetera, the different kinds of organizations we serve, we hear this idea that you're getting feedback from decision makers that truly do not understand your job. And that's okay. They're maybe not necessarily supposed to understand your job at that level. But if you're sensing that there's an element of micromanagement where they are implying that they understand your job better than they do, this is a manageable problem. You can use your implementation tool and your data tracking to actually ensure that your elected officials understand the issues you're facing and solving, the specific actions you're taking within your department, and those data tracking points to really show your progress updates. Now, whirlpools or shiny objects are a reality. I know we've talked about it at length, but something we try to coach organizations on, and this is a tough one, is if you're an elected official that's a policymaker, you are committing to these 9 goals for the next 5 years. That doesn't mean that you put your head in the sand and ignore anything else that comes along, but we want you to not have rabbit holes emerge that take you away from those 9 goals. The strategic plan is a tool to help you achieve things, but it's also a tool to say no. We know how hard it can be for especially elected officials to say no to constituents. But by setting your heart of the organization on these 9 goals, you're saying no to other goals over the next 5 years. So unless an issue can be directly tied back to your SWOT analysis or one of the 9 goals you've set, we strongly encourage you to not adapt or add more to this list. You have enough to implement already with 70-something initiatives. So you can do your best to steer the ship of the organization, your department, out of these rabbit holes, out of these whirlpools as they emerge by having a specific issue that relates to the strategic vision and reminding them of that. And that this document was consensus driven. Not only did it involve every department, every staff member, all of the commissioners, it involved extensive focus groups and interviews. This was consensus driven. So if you have one squeaky wheel that's bringing forth an issue, that shouldn't hold as much weight as a consensus driven process that took months and was exhaustive in its engagement efforts. When in doubt, bring it back to your shared vision. You came into some communication challenges when we started in this organization. There was a level of distrust. There was some folks who were skeptical to participate because they were worried that if they shared something, it might be used in a retaliatory fashion. But I'm so proud of the fact that you overcame a lot of those barriers and were extremely respectful in this process. You've created this vision on your own while we prettied it up and put the words together. The words are your own. So you really came together, even if things were shaky at time, and found a place of consensus and have a clear goal of where you want to be in the 5 years. So when ground gets shaky, which sometimes it does, bring your footing back to that shared vision. So that's all I have for today. We do have a few minutes left before the hour it concludes. If anyone has any specific questions or would like to dive a little bit deeper into any elements of the plan. If you're not comfortable asking in this public session, that's fine. I get it. Feel free to email me afterwards, but I do want to open up this floor if anybody does have any questions that they would like to share right now.
Hi, Allison. Do you have email addresses for everybody who's on this call?
Yes, I do.
Could you kindly email us these links that you put in the chat because they are not going to be available after this call ends?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions they'd like to share? All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, that's okay. If you think of one later, feel free to send me that email. I will send all of you an email shortly with all of these links. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for being here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to work with you over these last 6 months. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you, Allison. You too.